I was thinking about something the other day, and honestly, the more I thought about it, the more I wonder how many parents have experienced this. Have you ever noticed that every time you start doing a little better emotionally, something happens with your child? You know, you finally have a few good days, you've been praying and spending time with God, you've been in the Word. You're not checking your child's social media every 5 minutes. You're not trying to figure out what they're doing every second of the day. You're actually starting to trust God a little bit more. Then, out of nowhere, something happens. Maybe you see a post or you get a phone call. Somebody tells you something you wasn't expecting to hear. Or your child makes another decision that leaves you thinking, like, what the heck, right? And just like that, now you're worried again. Now you're upset. You find yourself laying in bed thinking about it. And now thoughts are crossing your mind and you just can't pull back from it, right? What if we're looking at this all wrong? What if the enemy isn't just interested in what our child is doing? What if he's interested in what happens to us when our child does it? Now, let me say this because I think it's important. Your child is not the enemy. Your son, your daughter, they're not the enemy. Remember, the Bible tells us that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. So, this isn't about blaming our children. It's about recognizing that we have a real enemy, and our enemy is very strategic. He studies patterns, he looks for weaknesses and opportunities. And I think one thing he understands is that if he can't get to the parent directly, then he'll often go after something that parent deeply loves, the children. Now, here's the part that really got me thinking. I wonder how many parents see themselves as a threat to the kingdom of darkness. Probably not many. Most of us just see ourselves as just normal, or worried moms, concerned dads, just parents trying to make it through another difficult season. But let's think about it. What is it that you're actually doing? Well, as a parent, you are praying, you're interceding, you're standing in the gap, you're asking and partnering with God to break chains and generational curses. You're asking God to expose lies and bring conviction, to send the right people into your child's life. You're asking God to open doors that no man can shut. You're asking God to do things that only He can do. Parents, that's not a small thing. That's big. That's huge. And I think sometimes we forget that. We look at ourselves and we see normal, we see weakness. But the enemy looks at us and he sees somebody standing between him and what he wants to accomplish. So if he can get that person distracted, discouraged, overwhelmed, fearful, exhausted, or consumed with worry, then he doesn't necessarily have to stop them. He just has to neutralize them. So let's be honest. The enemy doesn't necessarily need most Christian parents to stop believing and trusting in God. Most of us aren't going to do that anyway. But if he can get us so focused on the problem that we're no longer focused on God, then that's a win for him. If he can get us so discouraged that we stop praying and we're so emotionally exhausted to the point that we're just thriving or surviving, that's also a win for him. The enemy doesn't always need a major crisis. Sometimes all he needs is a distraction, just one piece of information that gets your mind racing. that gets your blood pressure up. One social media post, one phone call, one setback, just one bad decision. And then suddenly you've spent the entire day worried or fearful or trying to figure out what your child doing. Meanwhile, you haven't spent much time thinking about what God is doing. And that's exactly what the enemy wants. Not because the situation changed God's promises or his power or his plan, but because it changed your focus. And parents, if we're not careful, we can become so consumed by what we can see that we lose sight of what God may be doing that we cannot see. We forget that God is still working, that conviction can still happen. We forget that seeds can still be growing and God can still orchestrate circumstances. We forget that God can still do what only God can do. And that's why I believe one of the enemy's greatest goals is not just attacking the prodigal, it's discouraging the parent, because a discouraged parent is easier to distract, and a distracted parent is easier to exhaust. And an exhausted parent is easier to neutralize. Maybe that's why discouragement shows up when you're trying to pray and trust God. Maybe that's why some of the attacks seem to come right when you're making progress, because the enemy recognizes that you haven't fully recognized how powerful you are. You're not just a worried parent, you're an intercessor. You're standing in the gap, you're partnering with God. And every time you pray, every time you trust, every time you refuse to give up, you're creating problems for the kingdom of darkness. So the next time something happens with your prodigal, and let's be honest, something probably will, not to wish nothing, I'm just keeping it real. I want you to pause. Don't immediately spiral. Don't immediately assume the worst. Ask yourself, what is the enemy trying to do to me right now? Because the battle may not only be about your child, the battle may be about moving you out of position. And sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to move. So keep praying, keep trusting, keep believing, and keep remembering that God is still working, even when all you can see is the situation in front of you.